Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for this episode in our webinar series with Margot Note. My name is Bradley Ludke, and I will be your moderator for this episode titled Description. Before we start, I would like to provide some information about our company and introduce today's presenter. Lucidea is a software developing company specialized in museum and archival collections management solutions, as well as knowledge management and library automation systems. Our brands include Sydney, Presto, Argus, Archivera, Eloquent, and Quadrastar. Now I would like to introduce today's presenter, Margot Note. Margot is an author, archivist, and records manager, helping individuals and organizations harness their history. As a principal of Margot Note Consulting LLC, she facilitates the understanding of the importance of unique collections, suggesting ways to manage them and use them to tell stories to connect with people. She's also a popular guest author for Lucidea's Think Clearly blog and has provided us with many great webinars that are listed on our website. So please feel free to check those out after today's presentation. Take it away, Margot.
Thank you so much. So I wanted to talk about something that's kind of really near and dear to my heart, description, because I think when people think about digitizing, the focus that they have is on the actual digitization itself, like taking photographs or scanning the materials. But I think the bulk of the work that archivists do and the real kind of intellectual labor is just describing these unique assets. And that's not the same thing as when you look at books, for example, in a library. Everything is one of a kind in the archives world. So I think that has a real impact in the labor that goes into description. So with digitization, specifically with description, I think we're leaning, when we talk about description, we're thinking about kind of traditional archival best practices that we do. But then I think we've really been impacted, and I've certainly been impacted by looking at how kind of the visual resources communities focus on descriptive methods and kind of almost having like an art history kind of perspective to how you're describing images, documents, anything that you're digitizing. So I want to kind of go through these kind of different areas. I feel like the library, archives, and museum world were all kind of cousins that grew up together, but we are very unique. So obviously with library practices, you have objective descriptors like author, title, publisher, year. I mean, you have that information that's printed on that book. And because the book itself, typically, for the most part, has multiple copies, you can do copy cataloging from other people that have described the materials. So it is very easy to do a high volume of describing library materials because you can kind of lean on the knowledge of others. Museum practices, I think, are unique in the sense that they describe the collections first and then the items second. They group sometimes by creator, media, provenance, historical period. I mean, you go into a museum, there's certain curated exhibitions that you're looking at that kind of share these commonalities. And everything's subjective, you know, there's subjective attributes and descriptors. So obviously you're leaning upon curators to give you that type of knowledge for this one-of-a-kind work usually. But we are really focused on the items themselves rather than the collective, like the folder level. Archival practices are interesting because obviously they're unique materials. They're expressed typically at the item or collection or folder level. Depending on who you talk to, you know, I always advise obviously to describe things at the folder level, ideally, but even collection level or box level makes sense. In some cases, I think when you describe things at the item level, that's kind of a recipe to be completely burned out and is often unnecessary. So there's data gleaned during acquisition, appraisal, and arrangement that goes into description. And then archival materials also lack structures, titles, creators, or other elements. So there are structures that as archivists, we kind of take the chaos of archival materials and we put that, we create that structure. We create that order from these unique materials. So cataloging your description is very knowledge intensive. You have to know what you're looking at. It's time consuming, and it's an active translation. It's basically, looking at what you have, looking at the collection it comes from to give it some context, and then putting that onto the page. And I think we really underestimate as archivists what it takes to create that metadata, to create that description. So description for digitization, I think, is a unique concept. So there are, the description of the material should be adequate before digitization, but sometimes that's rare. I find that a lot of times people want to digitize materials and maybe they're not described or processed that well, or kind of baseline. So at least you know what you're looking at. And the act of the digitization project, for example, especially if it's funded by a big grant or a donor or some type of initiative of people within your organization that has kind of power and influence, that could be kind of the added benefit of a digitization project, is that you have to describe the materials. It's not enough just to scan everything and have it just be file 1, file 2, file 3. You really have to describe what you have. And so this is an excellent way to kind of build in and secretly like put in the processing as part of a project. It's like how there's these mom chefs that put like spinach into like cookies for people. That's kind of what we're doing. It's like we're giving the decision makers everything's digitized, but then we're also putting in the things that's good for them, and that's that description. Kind of a weird metaphor, but I think it works. Description, again, even sometimes description cannot even really exist, but maybe it's part or the beginning part of the project. It's definitely not the primary outcome. It's just a really nice benefit of this process. And sometimes what I've seen is that if there hasn't been some real push to describe things in a certain manner, sometimes it's, if people aren't well trained, or maybe you've outsourced the description, sometimes it's not as robust as maybe it should be. So something just to keep in mind as you digitize. So the project drives decisions. So obviously you're looking at and evaluating the costs and benefits of creating this metadata. Like how much is, you basically want like the Goldilocks rule, like just enough description. You don't want too much and you don't want too little. You want to have that sweet spot that it's usable without doing extra work that won't have a good result. So you really are looking at a cost and benefits model. I think sometimes that's difficult because I find myself really wanting to describe things that are really, like I want to cross all my T's and dot all my I's, where sometimes I have to pull myself back in these types of projects and think about, what is, it's kind of like MPLP. It's like, what can we do? Like, what kind of description can we do to get it out the door? And it doesn't have to be perfect or perfectly described, but it has to be workable and adequate. And there's different levels of granularity. So there might be parts of a digitization project or parts of your collections that are going to require more detail. Perhaps things have already been described and you're just transcribing it. That's an excellent decision. Sometimes you're doing it from scratch, so maybe it's a little less described. And you really want to consider the collections and users. So how much information are you going to give, and who is your audience? Is it an internal audience that knows the materials? Is it an external or public-facing audience? What are other contexts, let's say on a website or within your organization, that will inform people of what they're looking at? Obviously, if people know the materials really well, and let's say it's internally based, you won't have to go crazy with the description because they'll be able to fill in those dots. They have this subject matter expertise. So talking about expertise, there's both kind of the organizational expertise, thinking about the correct structure, syntax, and use of elements, like descriptive elements. And then there's also the subject, so kind of meaningful description. So you're making sure you're creating a structure that makes sense, but also making sure that you're providing information that gives meaning. And description, metadata, cataloging, these are all a significant cost. Sometimes that cost is hidden because we can say, like, let's say you're hiring a vendor, maybe they're digitizing, they're doing some quality control. They might be doing some metadata creation, maybe like they're creating folders, they're creating file names. Maybe they're embedding some metadata, maybe they're not. But we kind of focus on the act of digitizing, like the scanning and using the camera. I know decision makers, people that really make the decisions that are not archivists, are focused on that. But then we lose a real acknowledgement of how much work it takes to describe these things. So it's very labor intensive. It can cause bottlenecks because it's not the same thing as, it's not like you're scanning multiple images in one day. I mean, it might be kind of slower work to get these, to get that description in the materials, but it is necessary. It doesn't make any sense to digitize something that you're not describing. It's like basically taking, if you have archival documents, and basically just throwing it on the floor, it like out of their folders. It really doesn't help anyone. And what I always advise is make sure you have the physical materials organized first before you go to digitize the materials. That way you can create kind of a mirrored system, rather than what I find is that the physical materials are completely chaotic and the digital materials are chaotic too, and you can't find, they don't connect. And you just create, you basically double your mass of the materials. So you really want to move, be smart when you're making these decisions. So understanding description. There's a knowledge of recognized standards. So kind of knowing the standards that are out there, the data elements that you might need. It's the ability to apply them, and really multitasking between theory and practice. So thinking about kind of what are the best, like the theoretical things that we should be doing for a description, kind of those big picture issues about like the language that we're using, the terms that we're using. But then it also goes down to the practical nature of what you're doing. Like, what does it actually look like as a workflow as you're describing these newly digitized materials? So item level, this is what trips up everybody, and it always breaks my heart because it is so overwhelming to think about digital assets at the item level and describing them at the item level, because basically you kind of have to. So when you digitize something, you have these elements, these pages, let's say, of a document, or different images, and they are at the item level, and you do have to describe them at the item level. Whereas if they were in a folder, for example, you could just have it at the folder, you could just describe at the folder level. So, obviously the item level description contradicts the traditional archival practices of that collection level description or folder level description. And item level description is also more common with visual materials than text materials. So if I'm digitizing a publication that has multiple pages, I can just say, page 1, page 2, page 3, or whatever that is. I can put it together as a PDF, for example, or if I have correspondence from someone, that I can just put the date of it. But I think with images, there's much more material, there's much more information in those photographs or those visual images that you have to figure out that's not even clear based on text images. And because images are so powerful, especially with digitized images, that you do have to, you kind of get lost in the sauce of describing these things correctly. And it's not obvious. It does require some knowledge, some subject matter expertise. So linking at the item level can provide more information. It's searchable within and among collections, but it may be impractical. So that's kind of thinking about when you're publishing the materials, do you really want to really link these things to tell a story? Is it enough just to have it in one folder or one collection, or one, let's say, LibGuide online? So collection level is helpful for materials on the same subject. It's problematic, obviously, with collections with various subjects. So if you have a collection that is just kind of one subject, it's very clear what you're looking at. The description for that collection is going to be easy. You'll be able to kind of repeat some elements, maybe use a template for a lot of it. But if you're working with a collection that has all different things happening in it, it's much harder, and the description is obviously more intense. But it is that collection level description is necessary for large collections or limited resources. So as you can see behind me, I have a bunch of boxes. That's for a private client, and we digitized all of that at the item level. And it was not described at the item level because that would have been just way like too laborious and not necessary. So in that case, I worked with a vendor. They digitized things at the folder level. And it was like, whatever the name of the folder one, title 2, title 3, because it was a relatively large collection for a private person. And it was not necessary to spend that money to do everything at the item level. So I want to give some perspective, because I think when you start thinking about description, you can really get in the weeds. So encoded archival description is one way to create a finding aid that is really top of the line and really does make it searchable. So when you are describing digital collections and creating finding aids, this is definitely the standard that you want to use. And EAD in itself could be a whole series of webinars if we really wanted to get into it. I do suggest, looking into it. It is a very flexible finding aid. It's basically kind of a structure that you can put, or a container that you can put information in. And marks data contained in finding aids to be searched and displayed online. So it kind of speaks to the information gatherers online to make these finding aids more searchable, and yet produces searchable text. It's a really good way to get that material out there versus just have it on your website. And EADs are very important for kind of smaller organizations, because kind of the bigger name institutions that are having a ton of researchers, like they're obviously going to be drawn to the organization. They're going to know the organization to be, and then find out about their collections, versus if you're a smaller organization with kind of more of a niche archival materials, the EAD is a way to have people that are interested find you. So it's a really nice way to kind of bring people to your website, to put your materials out there to a larger audience, and then bring people in and have them get to know your collections. So they just continuing on EAD, they provide descriptions to facilitate cross-collection searching. So a lot of times if you're a researcher, you're looking at materials and they might be stored in different places. I always think of the James Baldwin collection. I mean, his materials are at least in 3 different places. And so the EAD would help you kind of find where those are. And that really depends on kind of what the researcher is looking for. It indexes collections with access points, and is a resource for standardized integrated access. So I think the headache that archival collections always have is that they are really unique. Nothing else exists like them in the world, but there are some kind of shared characteristics, kind of shared fields that we can fill in, shared containers that no matter what materials you're looking at, they're going to be filled in, like a bulk name, like a biographical note, the bulk dates, for example. It's just a way to make things, again, have chaos and kind of put some order onto that chaos, which is what all archivists like. Speaking of things that archivists like, this archivist loves Dublin Core. So I'm always a big advocate of it. I think if you're going to use a description schema or metadata schema, the Dublin Core, I think, is the easiest to use, hands down. It's the least expensive to implement. And I always say, when in doubt, choose Dublin Core. I like Dublin Core because it has, again, like the EAD, it has these certain containers, these certain fields that are super basic, can be kind of used and added to as needed. And it's also helpful. What I found, this is something that came to my mind recently. I'm working with a seminary and they want to digitize some materials, and part of what they can, not only will they have it on their website and kind of the databases or the portfolio, whatever module they use for their digital assets, but then they also are thinking about kind of distributing it in other places. So ATLA, which is the Theological Library kind of association, they have a library, like a digital library, and they use Dublin Core. So it does make sense that obviously Dublin Core is the easiest kind of schema that you can implement, but then it also is helpful if other places are using it as well. So you don't have to do like a crosswalk between schemas. You can just put in the information, and then it can enter into a bigger repository, a bigger digital library that will have people, again, that are interested in the subject matter that they're researching to find you. So that's why I love Dublin Core. It's so flexible. It's so easy to work with. So I want to kind of run through some of the data elements of Dublin Core, just so you can become familiar with them. And they're pretty, nothing I'm going to say is going to be like a shocker as far as a field. They're pretty standard. So the title, the identifier, which that could be maybe an accession code or whatever ID that you use within your collections, the creator of the materials, the contributor, if creator and contributor are different. So let's say you have a donor and maybe you have someone that collected it or gave it to you, a publisher as needed, language. There's also description. So again, like what are we looking at? Kind of like a caption, the subject, the coverage, the date, the type, and the relation. There's also the format, the source, and rights. Rights, I think, is a really important thing to say, who owns a right, what's kind of the credit line, which is always important for research. And so what I love about Dublin Core, so just again, looking back at all those data elements, I mean, there's a good amount to choose from. So you can use them as needed. That's what's so great about it. So no elements are mandatory. It's not like you have to fill in these fields. So for example, if you never have contributors, you don't have to use it. It can be repeated or expanded. So you can use elements again. If for whatever reason you need more description of a particular element. There's interoperability. So again, talking about, like, let's say digital libraries that you can give it in, you can upload the materials into, and it has kind of an international consensus. So that's what I like about it too, is that, a lot of people around the world have agreed that this kind of makes sense. I think that I was going to say something else about Dublin Core. I do like it because what I find is with description, no matter what you're looking at, whatever digital object or asset that you're describing, there's going to be about, I don't know, like an overlap of kind of what things are. Like everything I think is going to have like a title and an ID. But then there's, depending on your organization, you might have a very unique, based on your practices or based on the collections that you have, you're going to lean more heavily on some elements than another organization. It might look kind of wildly different when you can kind of compare the two Dublin cores that you're using. But that's what's really great about it. You can use these kind of simple, like Lego blocks, to build whatever you want. And that's, I think, the real beauty and the strength of using Dublin Core. So metadata is structured data about data. It is a standardized means of intellectual access. And it streamlines information transfer between hardware and software. So there's kind of different ways that we can use metadata, but it really does help us get information about, what we're looking at, this digital asset. There's an interoperability. Again, it's understood by humans and machines. It allows kind of an exchange of data, and there's kind of a minimal loss of content and functionality with metadata. So there's metadata types. So they could be administrative, so kind of talking about who owns this digital asset, how it was created, when it was captured. It's descriptive, obviously, we're leaning heavily on that. There's some metadata, preservation metadata that you can enter, as well as technical metadata. So administrative metadata kind of encapsulates the context. It manages information and it supports resource management. So it is really kind of like the about page of the digital asset. It gives you kind of the, what institution owns this, kind of the boilerplate information that you need for these materials. And administrative is often very repeatable. So maybe it's the same terminology, whatever digital asset you create. Descriptive is where you can get really creative. And obviously this is like the bulk of what we're focused on. So it captures the intellectual attributes. So it enables users to locate, distinguish, and select files. And it has the same kind of elements we talked about before: title, author, publication date, subject, publisher, caption, for example. I know in a past position I worked in, I was processing a lot of digital images, and I kind of had like a house-made metadata system based on Dublin Core that was basically country, site name, caption, year, provenance, so like where this thing came from. So was it from a final report? Was it from a final report that came from a CD or a DVD or a hard drive that we had in the collection? And then kind of who took the photograph, like the copyright information, because a lot of it was internal, but sometimes we had other photographs. So that was a really nice way to capture that information in the descriptive metadata. There's preservation metadata. So that's information that records about the record that protects it. And it helps with deterioration and destruction. And then there's technical metadata, so ensures the information content can be accessed, even if applications associated with the file have vanished. So metadata storage can be done in basically two major ways. So it can either be embedded in the file itself, or it can be stored separately. There's kind of pros and cons of both. I find embedded is sometimes nice, where let's say you have an image and you embed that metadata in it. That way, if wherever that image goes, you still have that information. And that I think really came out of photographers. So, professional photographers that are working for like news organizations or any type of photographic organization is going to have that metadata about their photograph embedded, because they want to be credited. They want to make sure that the caption is right. They want to be clear on copyright as well. So it is really nice to have it embedded. So again, embedded will make certain data will not be lost. It prevents problems of linking between data and metadata, because they live together, and then the metadata and the record can be updated together. So let's say the image, there's updates, if you change a caption or you find more information, you can change that caption, and they're both kept together. Stored separately it does have its benefits. It simplifies metadata management. So you can have the images that you have somewhere on your server, and then you can have, let's say, a caption sheet or something else. That's really helpful for when you're figuring out what you're looking at. What I found in some past projects I've done is that as we're digitizing things, I'm getting familiar with what we're looking at, or maybe we have subject matter experts that are not there right when we digitize. So we have these certain images, for example, and we want people to give us captions or some description, and they don't have to embed the metadata in there. They can work on that worksheet, and we can also update it as needed as we find more information. So it is a way, when metadata is stored separately, to be more exploratory. So it facilitates search and retrieval. It can be stored in a database. So again, you can have it, let's say, like old school, have it on a Word document. You can have it in a database that you can update it. You can do mass changes in a database too, which is really nice, versus having to go in each individual photo to make changes. And you can link that metadata to the images if they live elsewhere. Linking elsewhere always can be a problem because those links can be broken, but it is kind of a nice way, especially if you're doing universal metadata updates. So crosswalks with metadata are pretty interesting. It's basically when you map elements from one scheme to another. There's some of the issues that you have is sometimes the granularity of the target's elements versus the sources. So sometimes there's a mismatch. Like obviously, if you have a title in one scheme, it'll match the title of another scheme, but sometimes based on what schemes you're using, it might not have that one-to-one mirroring. And the compatibility of the content rules based to fill elements of each scheme. So I'll use an example. So I have a client that we were talking about kind of digital images, and they're working with photography. And some of it's fine art photography. It's a kind of a niche subject matter. But some of it's fine art, some of it's more like almost like a documentary, for example, like documenting versus like art photography. But it's a mix. And so the previous archivist came to that position and wanted to use VRA. So that's Visual Resources Association scheme, which makes sense when you're working with fine art objects. So if you're describing like painting or a series of sculptures or anything that's more kind of art, like fine art, museum based, VRA makes complete sense. And I totally understand where this archivist was coming from when he thought that way. But kind of in the opinion of the new archivist, and in my opinion as well, that scheme seemed overly complicated for what they were looking at. Yes, there was fine art photography, but it wasn't all fine art, and VRA was just too robust, I think, for what we were looking at. They were looking more for Dublin Core. And so we had been talking about kind of how do we crosswalk? We're getting a new software system. How do we crosswalk between kind of VRA to Dublin Core? And there are places where it kind of nicely was the same. It basically was mirroring each other. There are some places that was either the elements were too like granular or kind of a little bit of a mismatch. So we had to kind of make some decisions. But again, you know, that was a well-meaning, I think the decision to use VRA, I think was completely well-meaning at the time. I think it just got a little out of hand and overly descriptive, and it was unnecessary. So I think as archivists, we always have to think about like what's kind of good enough and what's good enough description. So description is really good for the representation of archival materials. Obviously, better cataloging equals better context. We want to give people just enough information that they can find the materials, they can find it helpful, they can use it in their research, they can use it for education. And description also helps users find materials more easily. It gives them information that they're searching for, and it allows, like if we describe an object really well, it allows the users to come to us, especially in a digital environment. And descriptive data, especially of all kind of the data elements, kind of the descriptive data or the caption is really the one that renders these materials, these digital assets, digitized assets. It just makes them just findable and usable, and having people use the resources of your collections, which is always a big win all around.
Thank you, Margot, for the wonderful presentation. We're also very excited to announce that you can download a copy of Margot's latest book, The Digital Decisive Moment, Transformative Digitization Practices. If you have more questions on any of our software or our company, our contact details are listed on the screen. Please stay tuned for more webinars and content related to this series. And on behalf of the Lucidea team, I thank you all for attending today. And until next time, thanks and goodbye.